We are looking at African creation myths this month on the Mythological Africans podcast. We started with an introduction last week, during which we established the 5 main kinds of creation myths that occur in cultures from around the world. There's ex nihilo creation, which means creation out of nothing, usually by a supreme godlike entity. There's creation by emergence, in which all that exists seems to emerge from under the earth or a body of water. There's creation by world parents, in which all that exists comes out of the union of 2 cosmic entities, usually a male and a female. There's creation from the cosmic egg, in which all that exists emerges from an egg. And there's creation by earth divers, in which a cosmic entity dives into the primordial waters and secures a portion of ground which becomes earth. In last week's episode, we also examined 2 Cameroonian creation myths, and that's because I am Cameroonian by origin and I wanted to share those. The first comes from the Balinyonga people, and it's an example of ex nihilo creation. The other comes from the Batanga people, and it's an example of creation by earth divers. And you can listen to last week's episode to hear the narrative. I'll link to that in the episode notes. In our analysis of these myths, we touched on how they both tie the creation of animals and humans to plants and trees specifically, which, though not scientifically accurate, in my opinion, hints at an understanding of the interconnectedness of plant and animal life. And connections such as these also pave the way for certain plants to be imbued with sacred qualities, with implications for ritual use and, by extension, conservation. And this cuts both ways. It could mean that the plant is restricted, and so access to it is not common, or the plant is so commonly used, its survival is actually threatened. Our analysis also touched on how the Balinyonga myth references a change in the people's understanding of the world and their place in it. And I think this arose out of the arrival of the first Europeans to the kingdom. All indication seems to point to this. We will leave Cameroon this week and head to Sierra Leone, it's a West African country, for another creation myth, this time one which starts inside the earth. Hello friends, and welcome to the Mythological Africans podcast, where we read and talk about stories from African mythology and folklore. I am your host, Helen Tunde. There was once a very big spirit who lived in a cave. He was so powerful that all he said came true. One day, the spirit said, "I have all this power. Why don't I use it? I have lived alone for a long time, with no one to talk to or play with." And so the spirit went to the entrance of the cave and said, "I want all kinds of animals to live with me in this cave." Thereupon, in pairs, the animals, including humankind, appeared. They entered the cave, and the spirit shut the entrance. After a while, the spirit called all the creatures together and gave them the law of the cave, saying, "I will give you anything you want, food and everything else, but you must not touch my food." Then the spirit looked about and said, "This cave is too small." He turned himself around and the cave became very, very big. The creatures were now very happy that they had plenty of room to find food. All they had to do was eat. The spirit too was happy. He had neighbors to talk to and to play with. The spirit was so big that all the creatures could not move on even one of his legs. He was very strict about keeping his law. On a certain day, one of the animals came to greet the spirit. As the animal approached, it smelled some sweet-smelling food. It wanted some of it to eat. When it saw the food, it took it and ate. and immediately found himself in front of the spirit. "What brought you here?" the spirit said. "You must have broken my law." The spirit then threw the animal out of the cave and said, "You, from now on, your name is Cow." Later, another animal ate the forbidden food, and the spirit threw it out of the cave, saying, "You, from now on, your name is Monkey." Eventually, even humankind ate the forbidden food and got thrown out. This is how animals got their names. All the animals and man are still wandering around in the world looking for that sweet-smelling food. This is one of several African creation myths in which humans either emerge from underground or a cave. It is also an example of ex nihilo creation because these creatures were created out of nothing and put in this cave by an all-powerful creator being. And this does happen where you see in one story where one or more types of creation themes are stacked on top of the other. This version of the story appears in a posthumous essay by Methodist missionary W.T. Harris. The essay appears in African Ideas of God, and this is a book by another Methodist missionary called E.G. Parrinder. And this book was published in the 1950s. Harris, however, and his wife lived and worked in Sierra Leone for about 27 years, and during this time, as missionaries tended to do in that era, he studied the Mende people, he studied their beliefs and customs, and documented much of what he found out, but he didn't publish much of his work. So when he died and his family and friends were going through his belongings, they found his notes and proceeded to revise and publish them. This is one of those situations where I find myself a bit conflicted, right? I am deeply suspicious at baseline of any mythological account recorded by missionaries, especially ones that might have theological implications. And this is especially so for this account because first there is another Mende creation account which does not involve a cave and does not have such a close resemblance to the Garden of Eden account. I'm sure most of you picked up on that already. And in that account, the creator being is actually excessively generous with the first human beings, gives them just about anything and everything they want, but then decides to withdraw from human beings after deciding that the generosity might be creating a dependency. There is also more context for the stories Harris collected during his time in Sierra Leone. One revelation I found interesting was that some of his accounts were not known among younger people. I have two theories about this. In one, time passes and there is Christian missions just spreading the biblical creation account to the point where many Mende people perhaps started deprioritizing indigenous creation accounts. And then, fewer and fewer younger people, especially if they went to the mission schools and they didn't participate in cultural events or traditional events, didn't remember the traditional accounts. And I don't know, given what I know about the Mende people, and I'm 100% open to being misconstrued here, I kind of find that one hard to believe. But my other theory is that time passed and the Mende people became aware of the way the Christian mission supported the goals of the colonial administration. And so they started feeling ignorance when they were asked about certain things. But that too is just pure speculation. That being said, this particular cave dwelling account is similar enough to other accounts from elsewhere on the African continent, which were not necessarily documented by missionaries. So I'm taking it at face value, seeing as I have to, at this time, make peace with having the colonial library that has invented African identities, as late Congolese philosopher Valentin Yves Mundimbe describes it, as my main source of information. So I'll go with this one with the understanding that there might be more to this story than meets the eye. But then there is also the fact that stories will change as people acquire new information and their values and beliefs shift for better or worse. And to me, the important thing is to pay attention to the details that are retained or left out, because those details say something about what the people are trying to communicate. This emergence from underground or a cave It's a theme that is not as common on the African continent as other creation themes are, but it does occur often enough to be noteworthy. Humans emerged from a cave in the creation narratives of Algeria's Kabyle people. Now that is an account with an interesting backstory. It was first documented and published by German explorer Leo Frobenius in the 1920s, but it wasn't until the 1990s, some 70 years later, that it was validated as a truly indigenous Kabyle account by Mokrant Veta, who was a Kabyle student studying in Germany. The theme of humans emerging from a cave also shows up in the Tswana creation myth, and in that account, Modimo, the creator, made a man who he named Matsieng and put him in a cave and gave the man animals for company. So it's similar to the Mende myth in that way. But then Modimo put women elsewhere and then basically sat back and watched as the man found his way to the women with the help of some animals. This Tswana account was recorded and published in 1926 by British anthropologist John Tom Brown. However, there's actually a place called the Matsieng Waterhole in Botswana. And this place, many Tswana clans consider it their place of origin. So that belief is fairly well established, very well established, I would say. Now, what's interesting about the story is that in the Tswana accounts, Modimo, the creator, is said to live everywhere, including the deep places of the earth. However, instead of interpreting this as omnipresence, as any regular person with 2 firing brain cells would, Scottish missionary Robert Moffat, who first translated the Bible to Tswana, used that information to cast Modimo as an underworld creature, essentially turning Modimo and all spirits associated with Tswana culture into demonic spirits. Thankfully, this mistaken impression was corrected in 1976 by Gabriel Setiloane, who is a theologian of Tswana origins. These two situations, as far as I see it, illustrate why African people, we really need to take our own myths and folklore seriously. Because in one case, what amounted essentially to academic beef between European scholars resulted in, important stories being ignored for almost a century. And then in another case, a missionary misinterprets a situation, and you have a whole belief system, a precious belief system, because amongst the Tswana, Modimo is the all-powerful creator, but the Badimo are the spirits of the ancestors who are created by Modimo to watch over the people, and so they all got lumped together as evil spirits, which, come on, that still persists even till today in some circles, and that's not cool, if I do say so myself. Anyway, I'll include a link to a thread in X that I did about this whole Frobenius situation. I'll put that in the episode notes. And if you want to know about this situation or the Tswana creation account and the commentary around that, I have the most perfect book to recommend for this. And you can check the episode notes for that too. Hint, it's called the MA book. Alright, where else do these stories where people emerge from underground or a cave occur on the African continent? Well, we're going to go back to Cameroon, my country of origin, and the northwest region, also the part of the country that I am from. And it happens amongst 2 people, the Babongo and the Bamongong. The Bamongong are the western region, but northwest, they're fairly similar culturally, so let's just say it's the same-ish people. Now, in the Babongo creation myth, there is a lake called Folrai, and it roared, and out of that lake roaring, exploding, 6 human beings, these are 2 brothers, their wives, their grandfather, and their uncle, came out of that situation. There was also a white goat. Now, don't ask me what that means, because I don't know, but I have a feeling that the Babongo creation myth is tied to the whole complex of folklore and mythological accounts linked to volcanic lakes in the northwest region. And there is an episode that I did about the northwest region's exploding lakes, as they're called, and I will link to that in the episode notes as well. The emergence from underground theme also shows up in the creation account of the Bamongong, as I mentioned, and in that story, the first ancestors emerged from a crack in the ground of a sacred forest called Efungela. The Akan of Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire also have a cave emergence story in which the first man and woman lived in a cave. And given the placement of Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire and also Sierra Leone, my feeling is that this cave dwelling story moved around the continent quite a bit, or independently emerged from different peoples across the continent. And it's speculation, but there are these settlements in the Sahara Desert which hint at a large population of people who lived in caves, and these settlements were long abandoned, like long time ago. So I wonder sometimes, this also happens in Southern Africa, by the way, so I wonder sometimes if some of these cave emergence stories are tied to people who in our minds are ancient, but then came across these caves which were inhabited by people who were ancient even to them, and so they created these stories, or they used these caves to explain the origins of humanity to their understanding. So that's a theory as well. So, well, what does it all mean, right? As I mentioned, I think that there's a tie to people seeing cave dwellings, seeing markings on the wall, artwork, and other artifacts left behind, and drawing conclusions. But there is a symbolic aspect to it too, because cave underground emergence on the African continent and elsewhere is often interpreted as referencing the idea that humans emerge from the ground in the same way that seeds sprout after being planted, or children emerge from the womb. So it's a solid understanding of how life happens and how life is connected and how life evolves. But then what I find interesting is that most of these stories have a period of strife or chaos or general confusion, which can only be resolved when the created beings leave the relative safety of the cave or the underground location. We see this in the Mendes story, where the strife is the created beings eating the food of the creator and then getting expelled. We see it in the Kabyle story, which, matter of fact, is crazy, because the man and the women are on the ground. They don't know about each other, and then they discover each other and they fight. First they fight, and then their fighting turns into something more. And if we're gonna put it away, they first made war, and then they made love, enough love to birth 50 sons and 50 daughters. But then after that strife and chaos on the ground, the 50 sons and 50 daughters emerge to the upper world and then go on to populate the rest of the earth. In the Tswana story, Matsieng, who is one-legged in many accounts, sees these mysterious footprints of some two-legged beings, and he just gets so obsessed with them and just about loses his mind because he can't find them. So that's the strife, that's the chaos. And so he keeps leaving his cave to go find them and begging the animals to help him find them. And eventually the animals help him, and that's how Matsieng comes to know about the existence of women and goes to live with them. So it's really fascinating stuff. And what I think is exciting is that this theme repeats itself not just on the African continent, as we've seen, but elsewhere in the world, with enough similarities, to make you wonder. But we'll stop here for the week, and you can come back next week for a closer look at yet another kind of creation myth, as told from the African perspective. Thank you as always for listening.